So I have to say that Jane did a tremendous job of setting up what's coming next, understanding the importance of the significance of ageism and its impact, negative impact on our health and well-being for all of us as we age. And it's a real problem. But what can we do? And as Jane said, the strategy of reframing aging, the reframing aging initiative is really a key component of combating ageism. And once you understand how to better communicate about aging and combating what people's cultural models or patterns of thinking are about aging, then I think that will go a long way into more positive impact. So I get to talk about the specifics of that communication strategy. And I have to say that in my under learning about this initiative and then adopting it and putting it into practice, my work, advocacy, really requires me to have the ability to persuade policymakers to make changes that support aging services to help people live at home and age in place at home. And in order to make that change and to have people understand why this is so important, um, I found that this work, this reframing aging work, has really made a difference in getting people to understand why it's so important and in a way that is constructive and productive. And so I'm just that's my plug for why this is, I think, a great strategy. And it applies to anything. It applies to your personal communications. It can apply to business communications. And any kind of work that you do. So as Jane said, what framing is really a series of choices, the choice of message of words that you say or you don't say. And I want to caution that framing is not about policing your words. It's not about being politically correct. It's not a marketing tactic. It is an evidence-based strategy that helps people better understand aging and helps them understand the concepts that you're trying to convey to them. And this, again, is based on extensive research that's been conducted by the Frameworks Institute. And so when we talk about the cultural model and patterns of thinking concept, I like to use this example of the you say, they think. And it's pretty simple when you think about it. But if you haven't thought about this enough, you will quickly understand why what you say is not necessarily what people think. So the you say they think model is one where an expert puts out a message that it sounds perfectly reasonable among your colleagues or in the office when you're talking among your peers. But then when you put it out into the public hears something different. And so I have an example here of how this works. So this excerpt on the left is trying to convince people to support greater public support for programs that help older people by emphasizing the cost of inaction. And specifically, it focuses on potential costs for younger people. So how do we think people will interpret this message? And I'll read the message. Aging populations pose a challenge to the fiscal and macroeconomic stability of many societies through increased government spending on pension, healthcare, and social benefit programs for the elderly. This may hurt economic growth and overall quality of life if governments need to divert public spending from education and infrastructure investment to finance programs for the elderly. So that seems pretty straightforward. Here's what the public has been found to think when they hear these kind of messages. I'm tired of all the taxes I pay being used to help other people. I'm struggling too because I'm taking care of my older family members. People need to stop depending on the government for taking care of their responsibilities. And I need to see benefits now of all those taxes I pay. So that is absolutely not the message that the expert or advocate was trying to convey. And I have another example here. And this is about ageism and workplace discrimination. This cultural backdrop has horrifyingly real consequences for many on the wrong side of 40. Formal age discrimination cases like Kleber's spiked during the most recent recession and haven't fully subsided. Long-term unemployment, defined as being jobless for 27 weeks or longer, is markedly worse for workers over 55 than for the general population. And then here's what the public hears. Age discrimination. By the age of 55, you should be capable of starting your own business if times get tough. Yes, the pay may be less, but the potential is worth it if you know what you are doing. I was discriminated against all of my life, but when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So don't come crybabying to me. Again, totally missing the point of the what the expert advocate was trying to convey about the seriousness of age discrimination. And so what's happening here? I'm going to get back to what Jane introduced is the idea of cultural models or patterns of thinking. And just to refresh what she indicated, that these are things that we all have ingrained into our understanding of the world, and particularly in terms of aging. And they are things that we've learned through experience and societal models and patterns that have emerged that we all tend to have. And it's through our years of experience. And as Jane said, they are things that, for the most part, if you hear something that might be a complex issue, that these patterns can help us interpret them in a way that makes sense to us. But we do that at the expense of losing the deeper understanding about those concepts. And I find this to be very challenging in the work I do. And I imagine you all may have similar challenges trying to explain complex government regulations or laws that govern a particular program, and people just not understanding, and they think of their own interpretation of what you're saying because there's just it's too complicated, and they have these models, what they're thinking about on their end, how they understand it to be a challenge. So this is definitely a problem if you're trying to convey a new message about aging in a way that's positive, if you don't understand what the cultural models or patterns of thinking are. And so, and this image came up that of the brain, and I like the idea of this being a very simple image to describe what's happening, is that we don't have empty fish bowls in our brain that we can just dump messages in and everybody interprets it exactly the same way. Instead, our brain is full of these patterns of thinking that we have. And so when we hear something, it's going through those different patterns of thinking to come up with whatever our understanding is. And so when you're talking to someone, think about the fact that you're dumping messages into a brain that's already full of stuff that they have to interpret what you're saying in a way that makes sense to them. And so what we're going to do is talk about how to get around the stuff that's problematic and get to the stuff that is really going to spark understanding among the people you're talking to. And that's through this idea of the swamp, as Jane mentioned. This is a great metaphor for what our brains are like in terms of aging. And this is a description that the Frameworks Institute came up with, which I think is a really great one, because swamps are rich cognitive ecosystems with lots of flora and fauna. And just like a real swamp is filled with nice things like orchids and dangerous things like alligators, our minds are filled with models that I just mentioned, those cultural models that, like orchids, can be good. They can be fruitful for the messages that we want to send in, or they can be models that are like alligators that swallow your messages and really take away from what you're trying to say. So the goal in this session is to understand the alligators and the orchids in the swamp of aging that are in people's brains, and thinking about the strategies for how to draw out the patterns of thinking that are more productive for the orchids. Now, I'm going to, in the next slide, show a video of the swamp of aging, and a couple things. First, because this video was part of the research work that the Frameworks Institute did, the people in the video gave permission for the slides to be, or the video to be used and their images to be used for the research. But as this session is being recorded, this video will not be part of that session. And so for those of you who may watch this later, you will not see this video. But the discussion will still be pertinent. So put in the chat, what patterns of thinking about aging did you hear in this video? Oh yeah, that was a lot. I agree. And it's tough to be old, kind of sums it up, doesn't it? People can't use technology. They're less capable. If you don't take care of yourself. Oh yeah, you're totally getting it. You have to eat right and exercise. No upside. A lot of financial concerns, Social Security, fear and pity. Absolutely. You're got them all. Disconnected, society moving on without them, can't keep up with technology. Absolutely. So great job. I mean, that's definitely hits the nail on the head. And we're really going to explore these a lot further in this swamp. So this is the swamp of aging. This is our map of the swamp. And you'll see in these boxes some of the things that were brought up in the video, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more. But if you look at this map of the swamp, that it really gives you a good image. The blue boxes, the larger boxes, are the alligators in the swamp. So these are all the things that when you're communicating, you want to avoid triggering these ideas, these patterns of thinking. And instead, you want to really feed the smaller boxes, the red boxes, which are the orchids, because those lead to a different kind of thinking about aging. And so we're going to go through and do a little bit more review of each of these alligators in the swamp. So the first one is the ideal versus perceived real. The public holds two contradictory views of aging: the ideal kind of aging and then the perceived real. The public's idealized vision of aging encompasses accumulated wisdom, self sufficiency, an active lifestyle, and earned leisure. That fact that you get to rest when you hit a certain age. And so this one really triggers the idea of the super ager who's done everything right, and this is the perfect way to age. Then you get to the other side of the spectrum, which is the perceived real. And so you've got the ideal, what people want, the ultimate outcome, but then what people expect is this perceived real. This is a sharp contrast with the ideal and is what people presume to be the reality of aging, a process of deterioration, loss of control, and dependency. And if you think about each of these versions of aging, they are highly individualistic because outcomes, either ideal outcomes or these perceived real outcomes, are thought to be the result of individual decision making. So it's our choices that lead to one of these two outcomes. And it disregards the idea that there are social systems and policies and other things at play that can impact aging outcomes. It's like a spectrum. And these are the extremes that people have in their mind that dominate when they think of aging. These two ideas also limit the public's understanding of the fact that as you're aging, you still have the ability to make social contributions. It's not all about what happens to you, but what you can bring to your community and just continuing to be engaged. So the second alligator is the us versus them, and this is very common in a lot of how people think. And I think Jane's first poll question about how old is old, nobody thinks that they themselves are old. It's somebody older than them. So that I think really exemplifies the idea that older people are considered other. And they are a social separate group social group that's separate and apart from the rest of us. And I like to say and think that aging's not a population, it's a process. So when you're thinking of people who are older, you've got younger people, you've got older people, it's really a process. And the other thing to think about with aging is what is the alternative? If you're not aging, you're dead, right? So, I mean, aging is a good thing, and we should all be really excited to be able to age and feel fortunate that that's the case. So, unfortunately, though, most people do see older people as other, and they compartmentalize a certain population that way, and they marginalize them. And then it makes it easier to think of when they're thinking of policies or programs or just anything regarding aging as something that doesn't apply to them, which is very problematic. It also triggers this zero-sum logic, and that is the idea that if you provide something like social supports for older people, that it's going to be taking away resources from other groups. And so that's problematic, obviously, when you're trying to advocate on behalf of a particular group, or having programming that's focused on a particular group of people. And people have a negative connotation of that because of this compartmentalization. And then messages about staying young or fighting aging reinforce this model of separate and opposed social groups. And digital incompetence is another thing that people have as a preconceived notion, a stereotype that would only apply to older people, when I know I am still providing tech support to my teenagers who may know how to do Snapchat, but don't necessarily know how to work Microsoft Word. So, I take exception to the fact that older people are digitally incompetent.
Beth, we have some good questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Well, this will be a good spot to stop. So let's see. I'm looking at a discussion. Which values do you suggest that we try to, and it's cut off. We're going, yes. So actually, this is exactly what my presentation is going to be about, is what messages are we, should we focus on in order to trigger the orchids and not the alligators? And so as we move through this, see if I answer your question through this presentation. And if not, we'll come back to it and have a deeper discussion about it. Right now, we're focusing on the things we want to avoid, which are the alligators. And I'm going to go on to this slide. This video is our governor in Ohio during the pandemic, who he was talking about vaccination rollout, and it just really gotten started. And I think this was a perfect example of how othering can occur.
Next question is from Randy Ludlow at the Columbus Dispatch.
Good afternoon, Governor. Can you hear me, Governor?
Yes, sir. I can, Randy.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
We are approximately 7 weeks into vaccinating Ohioans. And in that 7 weeks, we're only now up to 8% of the population. I know you say more doses are coming, but when can you realistically expect, given the backup of seniors, to begin offering vaccinations to average everyday Ohioans? What's your best guess on a time frame?
Well, Randy, I think a lot of the people who are getting the vaccine now consider themselves average Ohioans, but I'm just joking with you a little bit.
Actually, he did a really great job of calling out that reporter, and I actually gave the governor credit for doing that. But that, considering that older adults are not average everyday Ohioans, is insulting, to say the least, but is common to see that, oh no, those seniors, they got their vaccines and now everybody else can get them. So, and this is an example of what you can do once you figure out how to message things appropriately. Call people out. And actually call people out in a positive way too, if they're doing it right. So the next alligator to talk about is individualism. And I alluded to this when we talked about the ideal and the perceived real as outcomes. And those outcomes would appear to be based on individual choices. This is a dominant pattern of thinking about aging and outcomes, that the outcomes are based on good or bad personal choices. And the public reasons that whether someone ages well is a consequence of personal, financial, lifestyle, and health choices. And this really obscures the fact that there are social determinants that can impact aging outcomes and contextual factors that influence people's health and well-being as they age. And it makes it difficult to recognize the power of social supports to improve outcomes for everyone. Another alligator that we trigger often when we're talking about aging, and particularly now, is crisis messaging, which leads to fatalism, that the idea that nothing can be done, a pessimistic attitude about solutions. The picture here that you see is of a tsunami. And if you've ever heard of the silver tsunami, think of it now as something incredibly offensive because it's describing a natural disaster in terms of a population. And I really think it's problematic to be thinking about aging as a natural disaster. But anything that's talking about the age wave, a silver tsunami, I heard our Secretary of Commerce refer to the aging population as hitting the US like a ton of bricks. All of these things are really negative ideas. And they're also suggesting that there's nothing that we can do to address this horrible situation that's upon us. And that really causes people to shut down when they have they hear this. And we do this so much. I know in the aging advocacy world, in talking about needing support for programs, we lead with these demographics of we have more people aging, and it's going to really be a challenge to be able to support them unless we do something. And that really, we've done it for years. We've said that because knowing that the aging population's growing, and it's really not been effective. It gets your attention, but then you can't think of what solution can address the problem. The other solutions that can be alligators are, again, the idea that there are better choices you can make to improve your aging outcomes, and that if we just provided more education and information to people, that we could solve this problem. And I think a good example of this that I see in my work is in relation to elder abuse and exploitation, where if we just educated people about all the scams that are out there, then you'd be able to spot them. And I'm sorry, I know for a fact, having almost fallen for one or two myself, that no matter how much education, how savvy you are, that someone's going to come up with a better scam. And so really the focus shouldn't be on trying to get me up to speed, but trying to address the problem of the people that are actually committing these crimes against people. And so you see this a lot as an easy way to address a problem. People revert to, well, if we just educate them more and we provide more information, that, you know, that should help solve the problem. And that really really minimizes the impact of systemic policy change that we need to have happen for certain things to be better for people in the long run. And then finally, the last alligator is nostalgia and the threat of modernity. The idea that life used to be better and is getting worse is a common model that the public uses to reason about many social issues. And coupled with the sense of nostalgia is the belief that modern life threatens people's ability to age well. The public blames modern life for the breakdown of family connections, an unpredictable economy that makes it hard to invest or save for retirement, and the impending end of Social Security as a social safety net. So these are dominant cultural models. This is what we think of when we think of aging and problems. But when you think of these problems, people have a sense of fatalism, where they can't see that there is any system level change that can improve aging outcomes for people. So these are the alligators. These are the things that are dominant in our cultural models and our patterns of thinking when we think about aging. And that's that video that we started this whole session with. And so we really want to think about how to avoid triggering these alligators, because they will swallow up your messages. So I have a few exercises, and we're going to be doing a poll in a second to see if you can identify the alligators in some of these messages. So I'm going to start with the first one, and you can pull up the poll, please. So I'm going to read this message. The message is something from a piece of advocacy that we did a couple years ago before I became savvy to this whole reframing aging stuff. And so obviously we violated a lot of things. We have a lot of alligators in here, and I even gave you a good image of one. But I'm going to read this out loud.
Beth, before you
Yes.
read it, you might want to move your chat box because there's a big black screen in
How's
front
that?
of the text. That's great. Thank you.
This dual monitor stuff, I'm still getting used to it. So I apologize. All right. So you got your poll up. I'm going to read it. Thank you, Jane. By 2030, adults 65 years and older will make up nearly 25% of Ohio's population, up from 14% today. This dramatic change in lifespan is a cause for both celebration and concern. The massive numbers of the oldest old will unleash a torrent of Medicaid spending that threatens the state treasury. The burden falls to Medicaid because many individuals deplete their assets to pay for long-term care that Medicare doesn't cover. So if you haven't identified alligators, see what you can do now. And we'll give it a few more seconds. All right, what do we have? Move that again. Absolutely. I think you all really hit the nail on the head. Crisis messaging. I mean, the age wave is a dead giveaway, right? There's a zero sum that the oldest old will threaten the state treasury. Many individuals deplete their assets, so they're not planning for the future. And there's the individualism. and the dramatic change in lifespan. Yeah, I think you've hit it all very well. Great job. So we can close out that poll, and we're going to go to the next one. And you can pull up the poll while I read this one. According to the US Census Bureau, 11 million or 28% of people age 65 and older lived alone at the time of the census. As people get older, their likelihood of living alone only increases. Additionally, more and more older adults do not have children, reports the AARP, and that means fewer family members to provide company and care as those adults become seniors. So what alligators do we have in that one? All right, so I think we can close that one out. See what we have. Absolutely, perceived real. People are lonely, living alone. That there is that threat of modernity because there's fewer children to support their parents. There's definitely, I think, some us versus them going on. Yeah, I think that's great. Good job. Okay, I have one more, and this one's a little bit harder. Okay, so this is a quote that I found, and actually someone tweeted this out, and I had to talk to them about it. Anyone who stops learning is old, whether at 20 or 80. Anyone who keeps learning stays young. The greatest thing in life is to keep your mind young. So what alligators might this quote trigger? Okay, what do we got? All right, definitely fighting aging. That's pretty obvious. Fatalism and crisis messaging. I think if you don't, if you stop learning, then you're going to fall into this horrible category of being old. The ideal versus perceived real, absolutely. And I think there is some modernity there as well. So this message, this example, I think is a really great example of something that you may feel is true, but it's really, the point is how it's communicated, and that you're really othering people too. That's the other one, the us versus them, and that we are fighting aging, and so we all want to stay young. So again, compartmentalizing older people as a separate category that nobody wants to be is a real problem when you're trying to look at aging as a process that we all go through and really should be feeling fortunate about. So that is it for the poll. And the alligators, I think you all did a great job of identifying the alligators in those messages. And I think, I challenge you to look at messaging that you see every day and identify where alligators might be. So we're going to now talk about the orchids. What are the positive messages that we should be trying to convey and feed? So these are the orchids that we want to feed. What surrounds us shapes us, collective responsibility, and problems can be solved. So below the surface, there's a sense of that what surrounds us shapes us. The context we're in affects our lives and our outcomes, and that helps counteract the challenge of individualism and us versus them thinking. And so a common idea around what surrounds us, shapes us, in particularly in my world, are the social determinants of health. That it's not just health care, the actual health status of someone that is impacting their ability to be healthy, but that a large portion of what impacts your health is outside of your control, that's out in your environment, in your living space, in your genes. It's a number of things that impact us, but particularly your environment. And in Ohio, there are studies, we have at least one study that's in one county looking at zip codes, that there is a 20-year lifespan difference depending on where you live. And that is based on healthcare access, affordable housing. There could be racial disparities, access to services, a whole host of things, transportation. All of those things are considered the social determinants of health. And those are things that can have a positive or negative impact on our aging. And so we want to talk about aging in a way that is more than us as individuals. Also, is that we want to talk about aging in a way that seeing society is interconnected, and that we have a sense of collective responsibility. So this is the idea that it takes a village, that we all are part of a community that gives and receives, that we support each other and we benefit from each other. So this also combats the idea of individualism. And then finally, the idea that problems can be solved. Now, if you remember, we talked about fatalism and crisis messaging, and the more you talk about crisis messaging, the less people can think about a solution to the problem. So you want to lead with these problems can be solved, that we in our society have solved difficult problems before, and problems about how to age well are among those problems that we can address. And while challenging, acknowledging the contributions of older people and providing the supports we need as we age is a problem that we can address, and there are ways to do that. So these patterns of thinking are less dominant in the public's mind, but it's our job as we communicate these issues to trigger these, because it will have a profound difference in their way of thinking about aging. So we're going to do one more exercise in the swamp, and it's about the orchids that a message might cue. And so we're going to pull up that poll, and I'll read that question or message. How well we thrive as we age is really a question of how well equipped our communities are to tap into this resource by enabling us to be engaged participants. Everyone is more likely to enjoy positive aspects of aging, like good health, personal growth, longevity, and expanded productivity, if we start to think a little differently about how we shape the places we live. Area agency on aging programs provide dignity, self-determination, and quality of life for us as we age. We must ensure adequate funding and system resources are dedicated to the full spectrum of supports to enable us to live healthy, engaged, and secure lives, and access the supports we need in our homes and communities. So go ahead and see which orchids this message might cue. And we can go ahead and close out that poll. And I'm glad that you hit on every one of those, because that certainly was the intent of this message, and particularly collective responsibility. This message, and we can close the poll, is one we developed in response to working with the Reframing Aging Initiative. And this is the actual messaging we used in our latest budget advocacy to help policymakers, lawmakers understand that we need to do something about supporting aging services. And I'll just say that we were successful in getting increases in the budget as a result, and having lawmakers repeat things that we were saying to others and in testimony and in their own messaging. And so this works. It really does. So I'm going to close this session out with just tips on what to avoid in terms of the swamp. And our next section will really talk about a very specific messaging strategy that has been tested by the Frameworks Institute. But if you do nothing else, remembering the swamp is a good place to start in reframing aging. So just to kind of sum up this section, you should definitely avoid leading a story with demographic shifts. Don't say silver tsunami or age wave, or that we're going to be overwhelmed with older people. Any kind of crisis messaging that this will trigger the idea that fatalism, that there's nothing that we can do about this problem. So people think we have to do this to get people's attention. And again, I'm going to reiterate that yes, you'll get people's attention, but you won't get them thinking about solutions. Don't use language that refers to older people as other. And I did see someone reference elderly in the chat earlier and how it frustrated them. And that's with good reason, because people think of elderly based on the research that Frameworks did. Elderly is the oldest of old and is the frailest of people. So some people tend to refer to elderly meaning older people, and you're not exactly sure who they're talking about, but that's what you think of when you say elderly, and that may not be what you're trying to convey. Likewise with seniors, nobody knows what the age range of seniors is. And honestly, I know some people, they said that they were too young for AARP. AARP starts at 50 and I'm a member. So, you know, and they talk about that maybe being seniors. So seniors is kind of this vague term. And then it's also othering. It's a separate term for older people that doesn't really lend itself to, I mean, it triggers the us versus them idea, and it's unclear. So the recommendation is to use older people, because that will trigger a better response in people. They'll understand better what you're talking about and won't trigger those alligators. Pay attention to your pronouns. This will help you with the idea of the collective responsibility and combating that us versus them. Change what older people need to what we need when we are older, because the fact is we're all aging. And I finally heard a legislator say that in their discussion on the floor of voting on something, and it just sent chills down my spine. They finally caught on. Now, the other last thing is, I caution you not to be overly positive. You don't want to trigger that ideal alligator, the super ager, because then that will trigger the individualism idea that if we wanted people to think about you know, systemic policy change or thinking about aging in a way that is more than an individualist point of view, you don't want to really trigger that super ager idea. And so you want to give a balanced approach. We deal in with the area agencies on aging with a lot of frail people, but we also, you know, we do provide services to people who are not so frail. It's preventative health, and so you really portray people as they are. And so keep that in mind, that you're not trying to say the most positive version of aging or the most negative. It's really, we're all different. As Jane said, you meet one 80-year-old, you meet one 80-year-old. So these are some tips. There is a quick start guide that I don't recall if we've shared yet, but we will afterwards if we haven't. That includes a couple more tips on how to employ these strategies on the swamp.